Good afternoon. Welcome, everyone. My name is Susan Johnson. I'm the Historic Preservation Coordinator for the City of Tacoma within Planning and Development Services in the Historic Preservation Program. And it's my honor to introduce everyone tonight to our guest speaker, Sarah Steen. Sarah is the Landmarks Coordinator for the King County Historic Preservation Program. And this recording is going to be on YouTube later for anyone who couldn't tune in live. We are recording this and it's also being broadcast on Facebook Live. Just so you know, the chat function is not available for this event, but if you have questions, feel free to drop those in the Q&A function at the bottom of the Zoom screen. And we're also going to try and monitor the Facebook event for any comments or questions. So please ask questions. And with that, I will hand it over to Sarah.
Thank you, Susan. Thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to give this presentation. I'm going to quickly share my screen here. Okay, so this is actually a redux of a presentation I gave recently in Cincinnati, Ohio, and I left the main screen in because I wanted to give a plug to the National Alliance of Preservation Commissions. Hopefully you already know about this resource, but it's a National Alliance of Preservation Commissions, and it's a great resource for planners, for commissioners, anyone who's really working with regulating or dealing with historic properties in that kind of capacity. There's a listserv that people ask and answer questions. It's just a very healthy, lively community, and they recently had one of their big forums, which is their conference in Cincinnati. And so this is where I gave this first presentation then. So the presentation is integrating and centering equity, diversity, and inclusion in local government programs. And I paneled it with Alex Westhoff from San Francisco and Adrienne Burke from Miami. And I was really pleased. Probably one of the things I was most pleased about is that we weren't the only ones talking about this. There were presentations from Denver, from San Antonio, from a lot of other places around the nation that are really grappling with the same issues. And so it was a pleasure to be able to give our presentation and talk about the work we're doing, but also really see what else is happening around the nation as other people try to attack these problems in their own ways. And this is our program. So we are a regional preservation program, and I'll explain a little bit more about that in a second. I think everybody knows where we are. We're King County. We're in the center of the state. We have Seattle. And we also have agreements with 23 cities throughout the county. So we are an umbrella program. Basically, there's 4 of us in the office. There's Jennifer Meisner, who's the preservation officer, Todd Scott, Phil Letourneau, and me. And we do all the things that preservation programs generally do. We cover unincorporated King County, which is roughly the size of Delaware. And we have agreements, as I mentioned, with 23 cities. So they form an interlocal agreement with us, and we handle a lot of landmark stuff with them or other compliance issues within that city as each agreement is specified. So we handle cultural resource identification, environmental review, and education outreach and technical assistance, which is a pretty tall order for 4 people, but we're doing all right. On this subject specifically, I really need to start with Beyond Integrity. So Beyond Integrity is a work group under For Culture. And for those of you who aren't as familiar with King County, For Culture is King County's arts and heritage funding agency. And so they fund a lot of the preservation work that we do, like the nominations and the brick and mortar grants, and a lot of the arts projects around the county, but they also get very involved in things like this and really looking at how the practice of the practice can expand and how we can relook at the things that we're doing. So I really need to start any discussion of how we're looking at expanding our local government programs to really address the issues, the significant issues we have with diversity and inclusion. I need to start with them. So they started, and I'm not sure what year this happened, but Liberty Bank actually was one of the first instigators of this group to come together to really form a more cohesive approach to dealing with this. And what happened with Liberty Bank is in 1968, Liberty Bank became the first Black designed and Black owned bank in the Central District to start investing in the local area that had long been redlined and disinvested in. And so this was a really significant bank because it was funding a community that had been disfunded for many, many years. So it came, a community-led landmark nomination came forward when there was discussion of demolishing the building. And in the end, it went through a number of designation hearings, but it was denied landmark designation. And it was denied landmark designation because it did not have architectural integrity. And so Beyond Integrity came together, was a group of people that had an interest in this and said, and just noted how clear it was that the cultural significance was here, but it was denied based on its architectural significance. And so they really found that we need to have a much broader understanding of what significance is, and that it can't only hinge on architecture. Some of you have probably heard that I think it's 9% of our National Register nominations and National Register elected or listed properties are non-white male. So there is obviously a very, very heavy and very destructive emphasis on architecture when it comes to designating landmarks. And we're seeing it also in local programs such as King County's that is the case. And so Beyond Integrity came together to really look at what was important to communities, the cultural significance of places, and to really address how we need to reform our practice to look at significance. So Beyond Integrity kind of evolved from that. One of the things they've done a really excellent job with is every summer they fund an intern to do a study. And they've done 4 studies. These studies, they took a pause for COVID, but they're starting again this year. So these studies have really looked at the practice and in data analysis terms. We're looking at statistics, we're looking at our approaches, we're quantifying them in a way that we can communicate them easily. So in 2016, when they first funded this Beyond Integrity intern, they gathered data on designated landmarks in King County and Seattle. So King County and Seattle have separate programs, just so you know. And they made an assessment of what their connection was to underrepresented communities defined as women, people of color, the LGBTQ community, and the working class. I believe they added veterans in there and the people experiencing homelessness. But they did a kind of a scoring system based on what the level of association is. Is it mentioned in the context but not nominated for that? Is it mentioned in the actual significance section of the nomination, what it was nominated for? And they rated each one of these and where they're represented. And kind of unsurprisingly, the numbers are fairly low. We do have a fair amount of nominations that have associations within their context with underrepresented communities. A big one for us is European immigrants. Eastern European, Southern European immigrants are huge. Scandinavian immigrants are huge. So the immigrant category is often mentioned in the significance, but we don't have any for LGBTQ. And we have a number for labor, some for women, not very many, and very few for people of color. So we're seeing quantifiably that these things aren't being addressed in our current nomination practice. And then in 2017, 2018, they kind of did a co-study. They built on the 2016 research and really looked at the eligible properties that were not designated, really focusing on the ones that were associated with underrepresented communities. And they noted the high loss rate of those left unprotected. So if it was eligible but not designated for whatever reason, probably often for architecture, it was vulnerable and those properties get lost. And so they were able to really look at what the impact was of not recognizing and protecting these properties. And then in 2018, they selected 2 of the incomplete nominations to further research and to try to create model cases for future revisions. And we actually took some of their work and expanded on that, which I'll talk about in a minute. And in 2019, they used an equity-centered community design process to really look at how surveys were performed, which is huge because surveys form the bread and butter of what we do. We have to start with understanding what's there, and then we can understand how to evaluate its importance. So the fact that they're looking at how surveys are done, where we're actually capturing some of the basic parts of our cultural landscape is really, really important. And there's a number of things that came out of that I would like King County to use and other municipalities to adopt as well, because I think they had a really great approach and some really good guidelines for how to do things differently. And again, all these reports are available on the 4Cultures website for Beyond Integrity, which I'll include a link later. I'll send it to Susan and she can send it out. One of the things that we did, King County did, in response to some of the work that the Beyond Integrity work intern was doing, was we got a little bit extra funding from For Culture and from our CLG grants. That's through the Washington State Department of Archaeology and Historic Preservation, to do a project called Correcting the Record. So we looked at all of our landmark nominations and took a baker's dozen of the ones that were kind of the most obviously egregious based on the information that we had now. Just to see where they weren't telling the story. And I pulled this quote is actually from Time Magazine. Until we recover and replace the stories of the people who are deleted, we will, without even knowing it, continue to carry forward the deliberate bigotry of the past. And this quote is from an article about a PhD student who found that one of the earliest gospels, I think it was St. Mark, had been doctored to remove the presence of Mary Magdalene. So I was just noting that this was something that has happened for a really long time. And the correcting the record to add people back into our historical narrative who were omitted or ignored or deliberately left off is really key to understanding our own history and sharing how dynamic we are as a people. And so we took the top three. So the ones that we did are on the left of your screen or stage right, I'm not sure which, but it's the Fall City Hop Shed, the Hotel Redmond, and the Newcastle Cemetery. We were able to hire an intern to work on the Fall City Hop Shed and the Newcastle Cemetery. And then we worked in-house on the Hotel Redmond. So for Native American site and hops workers, the Fall City Hop Shed had really not been recognized for one, where it is. It's in a pretty hugely important former village site near Fall City that has a remarkable history, not only at the transitional period when white settlement was happening, but the 10,000 years before that. And also in the hops industry, the Native Americans played a huge role. They were migrating here for the season. It's a short, intense seasonal harvesting period, and they were migrating here in such numbers that they became part of the Seattle economy. That there's still photographs of them camping along Pioneer Square down there. On the water and in areas that their camps would be set up. So they would be migrating over here to work in these hop fields. And the largest hop field in the state was just north of where this Fall City Hop Shed is. And so there's huge amounts of association that weren't caught by the original landmark nomination, which was roughly 2 paragraphs long and mostly talked about other buildings and most of the white men in the area that were running them. So it really missed a lot. And Hotel Redmond, they spent a long time really identifying with Justice William White, who was a very important figure. He was a state Supreme Court justice. He was part of the territorial or the early, he was district attorney. He was part of the national scene. He was big in politics, both as a Democrat and as the Bull Moose Party under Theodore Roosevelt. But they neglected to mention his wife, Emma McRedmond, who basically built the hotel on her father's land and was herself very prominent in local politics. She ran for county clerk 2 years after women got the right to vote. They got the right to vote in Washington in 1910, and she ran in 1912. And she only narrowly lost, but she was also prominent enough to really be listed in the papers. We found a couple of newspaper articles, which is really rare to cover women in politics in this age. And she was supporting other women getting into politics. So she was a pretty big player in local, but she didn't have the documentary history that he did because women weren't covered as much. So we did a lot of work uncovering her story and including that. And the Newcastle Cemetery, it does a great job covering all the European immigrants that came over to work in the mines. Mining is one of the most diverse of the early industries here, but they didn't cover the Black and Chinese coal miners at all. And we do have a decent, well, we have some information on the Black mining history of the area, including some really wonderful photographs. We don't have a lot on the Chinese because that was pretty fraught in that era. There was a lot of anti-Chinese sentiment and really a lot of struggles about how the Chinese worked here and where they went and who ran them out. And there's just kind of a complex story with that, and all of that had been neglected. So we added that back into the record. Hopefully you've been able to see my screen this whole time. I just got a note that you can see it now. The two on the right, the Reynolds Indian Agency is owned by the Muckleshoot tribe, and the Neely Mansion is run by the Neely Mansion Association. These two are also landmarks, and they're also being revised right now by outside parties. And so we're seeing this kind of this whole correcting the record is catching on, where people are recognizing that their landmark nominations usually done in the 70s, 80s, or 90s are outdated, that they're sparse, and that there's a lot more to the story of these buildings that isn't captured. And some of the other, so that's some of the things that we're doing in-house. We learned a lot by doing this work. One of the things that we learned is it's really not very time efficient to rewrite the nominations from scratch. We have so many other resources to capture. We have so much more to do. How do we do this really effectively using, I mean, we only have 4 people in our office and we're doing a lot of work. How do we do this? How do we correct the record in a meaningful way in a larger scale, in the scale that it is really needing to do? So some of the conversations that came out of the correcting the record effort was, how do we capture really good history, like really good research, really in-depth study with oral history, with getting primary sources in places that they're hard to find, like doing all the things that they're really in-depth, highly skilled history with the communities that need it done. How do we kind of balance those out? One of the things that's happened with nominations, I think probably most of you are familiar with, is that they've become, there's a much higher bar to getting them done. They cost a lot of money. They can cost $5,000 to $7,000 pretty easily. We are lucky that we have for culture that we can tell people, go get a grant and have them pay for your nomination, but a lot of places don't have that, and the grants can't cover everybody. So how do we reduce the monetary paywall and the bar to getting these things done without compromising the information that really needs to be included? And one of the ideas that we came up with is really looking at how we can help with surveys and context statements. How on an agency level we can partner with community organizations and community leaders and community members to create really in-depth, good histories, context statements, and then we can reduce the load needed for an individual nomination to really focus much more on the building. We could even create, and I'll talk about this later, but templates, like simpler templates to capture the building that ties it to the larger context statement. It just needs that specific information. So that actually accomplishes a couple things. It gets a bigger, broader story written down, and it provides a good resource, but it also makes it easier for people to nominate buildings and landscapes that are really significant to them, because they can tie it into a larger story. So that's one thing that you can do on an agency level. We're also looking at things like how we evaluate and what our criteria is for landmarking nominations. So when I talk about things like beyond integrity and the focus on architecture, that more and more municipalities are adopting cultural significance criteria, and they're doing it in really a lot of different ways. Like Miami, I found out they have some of their districts that the only thing they can't do is demolish, because they're not designated for their architecture, they're designated for the significance. And the communities that use those buildings have a lot of leeway to change them, but they can't demolish them. So that's probably the lowest threshold I've seen. But I've seen a lot of people try different things to figure out how do you regulate a physical space when you're not regulating a physical material or a physical look. How can you regulate for cultural significance, especially if the use changes? I think the showbox is probably a good example of that. We're looking not at architecture or at use, but what happens if Showplace shuts down? Like, is it still significant? So that's kind of the question that everyone's grappling with and trying to find different approaches on, is how to catch that intangible, the cultural significance in a physical structure, and how do you regulate that? One way to do it is to adopt the cultural significance criteria that really gives a path to designating for significance, and then we can work out, usually probably with the owner at the time, how those regulations are going to be implemented. And we can look at that as a more flexible tool going forward. Also, we can still weight non-architectural aspects of integrity now. If you look at association, feeling, and location, you can really highlight those. We don't have to only go for architecture, even as our criteria stand now. We can look at really highlight the areas that it does meet those kind of the cultural significance and doesn't meet the architecture. You don't have to always weight architecture when you're considering things. And then highlighting intangible significance in your studies as well. That's something that's kind of key. And the third thing we're doing through our strategic planning effort is to focus on in-person relationship building with underrepresented groups. And that basically means that we attend meetings, we support initiatives, we propose partner projects. And when we can, develop and fund gatherings and workshops for process and knowledge exchange. One of the things that I got from the Cincinnati conference was there was a session on a Cincinnati work that had been done by a professor who works at the University of Cincinnati, and a community leader whose family had gone back for generations in this church that ended up getting lost. But they formed a partnership, and she had the institutional and process knowledge, and he had the community knowledge. And so they came together and they were able to use each of their skills to build a really full fight for this landmark that ended up being lost. But I thought that their whole kind of template for how they do it was a really, really effective way to do this. Like we don't need to go into places and tell them what's important. We need to go into places and partner with the community members to determine what they see as significant and how we can help them get that recognized. Fundamentally, kind of a shift in how we see ourselves. I also want to talk about cultural significance as a whole. So not a lot of people are hugely familiar with what's called cultural landscapes. And the difference between cultural landscapes and the traditional historic preservation practice that focuses on buildings, as cultural landscapes look at a broader area over time, and they look at the systems within that area and how they change. So it's a more dynamic, it's more flexible. It tends to be more interconnected. So you're not going to see individual buildings here and there that are landmarked. You're going to see a whole system that's being considered. One of the things that we're talking about in-house here is we have a lot of these prairie lands that actually have multiple layers of significance to different people. There may have been a village site there, and often was, because usually these are near water sources. Then there's a farming history, and then there's a recreational history. So you see these layers of significance that get built up over time, and each one is different to the different groups. It means something different to different people. And so how are you going to capture those dynamic stories? And we're looking at ways kind of outside of the whole regulatory framework to address prairie lands, to address, like, maybe there are other conservation tools that we could use, that we could partner with, that they tend to focus really on the natural history, and we can do a partnership with cultural history. There's just a lot you can do if you get a little flexible about how you're going about it. So I really wanted to bring in the whole cultural landscape and cultural significance idea. Some of the things that we're doing on the right, you'll see this list. Community landmarks is kind of a key one for us. So community landmarks is, we landmark things that may not reach a threshold of a full landmark. So it's representative. It's community landmarks are honorary. They're similar to the National Register or the State Register. They're just really recognizing that this is important to the community. Although for whatever reason, maybe it's a religious organization and they aren't interested in regulation. Maybe it's really, really changed and it doesn't hit the architectural standards. I mean, maybe there could be different reasons why. Like we have the Falls City Residential Historic District, and the owners weren't interested in doing a full designation. So they agreed to a community landmark. And one of the things that does, I mean, it's kind of like National Register, even though it's just honorary, it provides a real recognition and a cohesive story for a place. And that does help create the culture there and help keep it intact. And so these do have kind of a moral value, really. They really just kind of talk about the story of the places in kind of one document. It's all kind of pulling together, and people they become proud of where they are, and they become connected to that story. And so these honorary distinctions have purpose. And under the community landmarks, we do things like heritage corridors, this could be used in a variety of different ways. Right now, those are limited to kind of bucolic, historic King County roads, but there's so many things that we could do with heritage corridors. And I'll talk about one that in just a minute that could be used as a heritage corridor, that's talking about when the Japanese and Japanese Americans were evacuated from here. That could be a heritage corridor. So there's a lot of ways you can open up some of these that aren't necessarily regulatory, but they can offer some recognition, a cohesive story, and a sense of place to these places that can be built on, and that pride can be expanded. Two others that we're looking at seriously, as I mentioned, cultural landscapes, that kind of fits a little bit more into the rural areas, and most of King County is rural. So that fits pretty well if you're going to put it together, kind of a large networked system. But a lot of cities right now are looking at cultural districts. San Francisco is the leader in this. They have, I think, 5 cultural districts, and those they're very regulatory. They involve all kinds of economic regulations and other things that really are aimed at keeping the community in place. And we've been talking in our office about, there's an area called White Center here. It's this odd inholding of unincorporated King County land just south of Seattle. And it has a pretty artistic and cultural district. It's mostly Latino, I think, at this point, but there's been a lot of people going through there. It's gentrifying quickly. It's one of those areas that gets filled in quickly. And so we're looking at the cultural district as maybe an approach that works better than a historic district for this area that might entail different kinds of regulations or different planning practices. But that's another option. So we're looking at other ways that we can recognize and protect places that don't only involve the whole idea of landmarking. And I note here that sites with the underrepresented association, that they don't get designated, they're demolished at a high rate. So there are some issues that we need to consider with unregulated places. If the recognition is higher, that tends to be a little bit less, but we lose places that we don't know about or that are vulnerable to pressures and unprotected. So when we're looking at those things, we need to really take those into account as priorities. The one I mentioned for a heritage corridor was in the 2019 For Culture, the Beyond Integrity intern plan. She mentioned this spot, and I thought her idea was really, really brilliant. So prior to their incarceration in 1942, Japanese and Japanese Americans were hugely significant in King County's White River Valley. They were big, giant in agriculture around there, and on Vashon and on Bainbridge. The Sumner Packing Company was owned by I. Yasumura and Sons to sell packages and transport produce from local Japanese farms. And the shed that you're seeing in this picture was actually the second shed. So the shed that he built burned, I think right after or not long after they were evacuated. The Japanese Americans were removed from the area and incarcerated. So this shed is the second one built after he left. So it really wouldn't be landmarkable necessarily. It's more representative of the area. Although a lot of the area looks similar, it's still really used for agriculture. The shed isn't necessarily a structure that is, even though the location is the same, it's not really associated with him. But this was also the place, this was the train stop where local Japanese and Japanese Americans boarded evacuation trains to Bindale Assembly Center in Fresno before being sent on to internment camps. And so there was a lot that happened here that you can't see. There's a pretty huge history here. One of the things that the intern noted was the location. Let's see if my mouse works. Yeah, it does. So here is that site. Here's where that shed sits. And here is the interurban trail that actually was formed on the old, there's some railroad tracks that are still operating, but this is an inoperative railroad line. And this is a great time because people are biking and hiking here all the time. So when we could make a heritage corridor out of the railroad line, one, that's possible, that took them away to the assembly centers and the intern camps. But two, we can also do a lot of interpretive material along here. One of the things I like about sign, there's a lot of people have mixed feelings about interpretive signage. But one of the best arguments I've ever heard of installing it is that it catches the people that don't self-select. So, when you go to a museum or you go to a historic site, people are going there because they're interested. So how do you get the word out to people who don't seek that out, who might actually find that they're really interested? And so if you put interpretive signage explaining that this was the site where all the White River Valley Japanese population was taken away from, and then a bit of that story so people can understand where they are, you're catching people who wouldn't necessarily look out for that and might be really interested to see where they are. I want to raise awareness of that practice, though a lot of people still don't fully understand here. And so I think that's another way to raise awareness and to capture. We could put a cultural landscape as an historic, like an honorary overlay. There's a lot of different things we can do to really capture some of the history of this without necessarily landmarking. But also, as we do those kind of things, as we do those studies and we work to engage community members, they might raise the possibility that there are things around there that could be landmarked. I mean, there's still tons we don't know. We haven't done an in-house survey since 2013, I think. There's been a few other spot surveys, but again, King County is the size of Delaware. Like, there's a lot we don't know that's still here. And the more you can involve community members, especially older community members that have a memory here, the more information you're going to get about where you are and what is still existing and what stories have been lost and so on. So there's a lot of value in just getting out there and starting these conversations. You can really build on them. So you might be, many of you who are dealing with these issues already might be pretty familiar with some of the challenges that we're facing. The map on the right is the redlining of the Greater Seattle. I think it's a 1936 map that really kind of describes the disinvestment of certain communities and neighborhoods. But some of the issues that we're dealing with as a commission and as a preservation program is lack of underrepresented community representations in commission staff and decision makers and meaningful higher level support. One of the things that we are consistently trying to do is recruit people from, all over the place with many different skills and credentials. We have a 9-person board, and that becomes 10 people whenever we deal with the city because they add their own member. And so we're recruiting, but not only is it can be hard to get out of your own circles because the preservation community gets kind of insular, and a lot of people don't know about us, and we're just trying to reach out as much as we can. Not a lot of people are volunteering. This is not a huge amount of time, but it is amount of time that you're not paid for. And many people are pretty busy these days. And so it can be tricky to get people, especially working people, on your boards and commissions. So that is something that we regularly face. We're working now to kind of build a pool of people that we can tap as our positions become open. And we're looking at adding some flexibility into what each seat represents to try to capture a broader array of people. Paywalls and lack of resources available to community members who want to nominate a property who can't. I mentioned that earlier, like the fact that it can cost anywhere from like $5,000 to $7,000 to do a nomination. That's pretty off-putting to a lot of people. They don't necessarily have that money lying around to do this. So how we can kind of ease that burden, one way is through grants like For Culture does. Another is to make the nomination forms a little bit easier to access. Lack of process knowledge, research writing experience, or lack of public access to reports, studies, and prior research. For us, most people still have to come to us for information. We have some stuff online, but we don't have like a big GIS database linked to all of our archives. And that's something that's in our strategic plan now. We really need to get the information that we have more publicly accessible. Like, we will do the search and find anything you need, but you need to know to ask us. And so that can be limiting. You can't just do a search online to find out what we have. And so it's important for us to really prioritize getting that information out there and available to people who are looking for it. And as far as process knowledge and research writing experience, that's kind of falls under capacity building. And there are a number of projects that I'll talk about in a minute. We're really working to build capacity with familiarizing people with the process, getting them to know what, not only making some of the process easier, but getting other people familiar with it so they can actually approach doing landmark nominations. I mean, if you think about the National Register, how it started, it really started for community members. All those old 60s and 70s nominations that were 2 paragraphs long were 2 paragraphs long because it was a community member that was writing it. They were intended for community members to nominate their own resources and places that were important to them. And as our field has professionalized, that's, some of the skills are wonderful to have. Like, we need to have these high level historic research and writing skills, but we can't cut it off entirely, as I think we have done, by professionalizing it to the point where other people no longer have access to it. And so I think we need to step back and take a look at what this is supposed to do and how we're supposed to proceed from now. And then, as I mentioned, the insular preservation community, we can be kind of a small club of people that all know each other. And there's some lack of flexibility and depth in evaluation or application of criteria. We have a set idea of how we move forward, and we aren't always very flexible in how we approach that. And so that, in our case, that tends to really put too much emphasis on architecture and design. And then just the basic problem of how to identify, protect, and regulate cultural and intangible heritage. So that's a very real problem of how to meld those ideas of intangible and physical space. And we're working on, I think everybody now who's dealing with this is working on developing new ways of looking and new ways of approaching to deal with that problem. And then some ideas and approaches that some of which I've talked about. Streamline templates and form with information prompts could be one. The significance criteria, the HP code, which we're working on this year, forging relationships, actively seeking project co-sponsors, and building capacity. That's using what time you have to reach out and form relationships with people to understand what's in your community rather than just driving around and looking at houses. Networked resources and publicly accessible research, and then crowdsourcing digital infrastructure. I'm a fan of story maps. I like story maps. I think they're really a pretty way to engage people and tell a story, but they are only one way. And so we need more things like MapMe or other ways that people can find what they have around them or share the knowledge of what they have around them in a a digital mapping system. And I found that MapMe was one that people use, but there's a lot of others, I'm sure. And having, I know that Washington Trust has used that a few times, and I think DAP has used that once or twice. So those can be, for those to capture the people that have some, tech savvy or on the computer, that can catch some of that. It won't catch everyone's story, certainly, but it's just one tool and hopefully a big toolbox of other options that you have. And one of the things that I loved about the 2019 report from the Beyond Integrity intern was really how to look at survey in a way that's not looking at individual buildings and dating them or neighborhoods and dating them, but really if you're trying to capture these intangible cultural significance, especially if it's lost. Like I think LGBTQ offers a wonderful example of how architecture does not work to serve that community, because gay people were using buildings, were hiding for many decades, and were using spaces that whatever was available to them. They were never building giant buildings for their own community until fairly recently. So if we're looking at the history, you're not ever going to find them reflected in architecture. You're going to have to look at intangible spaces and transitory spaces. You're going to have to just look at the whole thing differently. So I really loved the examples of spaces that can hold intangible significance, cultural significance. And they looked at points of origin, routes of migration, places of experience, places of suffering and struggle, achievement, interaction, spiritual places, milestones of international relations. It gives you a list or an idea of how to look. So if you're going to go into a community and you're trying to find these spaces that may not be physically evident or visible, how do you look at that? How do you assess? You're going to have to go to documentary sources to start with instead of starting in the field. You're going to have to figure out where these things happened through newspapers or through community newspapers and newsletters, through talking to people, through ways that are not necessarily our comfortable go-to. We do this and then we do this and then we do this to find the historic buildings. But you're really going to have to approach it differently. You're going to have to do more of a hunt and more of a kind of an archaeological dig. And I think that's a great way of really approaching it when you have this kind of list. Oh, I'm looking for the points of origin. I'm looking for where this struggle happened. I'm looking for, how these people kind of intersperse themselves in the community in both obvious and obscure ways. And so I think that can be really valuable if you're undertaking a survey, like if you're doing LGBTQ, how are you going to look at that is going to be more defined by all these questions of intangibility. And then, as I mentioned before, localized public interest and community pride, the more people kind of recognize what's around them, the more people tell the stories, the more people participate in the formal recognition that their culture is significant. That's such a huge confidence builder, and just being recognized by the people around you is like, yeah, this story really matters. What you've done has mattered. What your ancestors did mattered. Just that recognition can really build community pride, both internally and externally. And so the more we do this, the more we get out and to gather these stories and to build this infrastructure, the more we're going to see people come forward and really recognize what they have and put it forward for landmarking. I don't know how many times when I've been recruiting for the commission, the people I would hear in one way or another, usually very politely, but how does this affect me? I'm not involved in this. This doesn't capture my story. So if you 9% of National Register nominate or designations are non-white male, that's a valid question of like, if you're not addressing my history or my community history, if I've been excluded from the larger story, why should I take part in this is a really valid question. And I'm hoping that as we implement all these small and large changes, and a lot of these changes can be done on a small scale. You don't have to start with the big things. I mean, the big things need to be done, but we can start small, and it will hopefully become larger. It will become as just kind of a network. I mean, we got to here over a series of small steps, so we'll get somewhere else by the same method. There's a lot of projects and organizations doing really great work around King County, but there's two larger ones that I wanted to highlight for the conference. And one of them is the Black Heritage Society in Historic Seattle has just received grant funding to host workshops aimed at building preservation, planning knowledge and skills within the Black community specifically. So that's very focused on capacity building and training people how to approach what the process is, how to approach landmark nominations, how to get their, to recognize sites, to get them documented, how to research, like that's capacity building. That's entirely human skill to human skill. I think that's a great use of those grant funds. And then one I'm really happy that they're doing is the Washington State Department of Archaeology and Historic Preservation is they're looking at, and just in Seattle, I'm hoping someday this will go to King County, but right now it's just Seattle. They're underrepresented communities mapping projects. So they're engaging with public engagement professionals, community groups, crowdsourcing. They're trying to get everybody on board to really identify the things that are important to their communities. Like if you're looking at the Central District, they're looking at who's there now and who's not there now. And they're looking at what spaces are remain and what's been lost. And they're trying to get ahead of some of these big infrastructure projects like the light rail. They're kind of midway, but they recognize they didn't have this information. And so they're really focusing not on cultural resource firms, but public engagement firms. They want to hear what the community has to say about what's important to them and what's impacted. So I think it's really unusual as a mapping project in the fact that they're trying to get ahead of some stuff. And I applaud their efforts to doing this. I think this is really important, and I hope it becomes more normal that we would really go out and search before something destroys a neighborhood, before the destruction happens. And so I really wanted to highlight that project here. Oh, and then I'm at the end. So thank you again for inviting me to this. This was great to showcase what we're doing and what other people are doing, and I'm happy to answer any questions you might have.
That was fabulous. Thank you, Sarah. I know we have some of our landmarks commissioners from here in Tacoma here with us, so I want to give them a chance to ask any questions. I think some of this will be very timely for some of the work that we're talking about and looking at in Tacoma. So do any of our commissioners or any of the attendees have questions? I see a hand. Commissioner Zeno.
Hi there, Sarah. Thank you very, very much for the presentation and sharing your knowledge. I really appreciate this. I'm George Zeno. I work at Pacific Lutheran University, and I am working on a number of different outreach programs with our tribes, and specifically to our land that we occupy here in Parkland. And one of the things that come up that we recognize, and I'm interested to hear where this may place in your criteria match here, is that we discovered indigenous technology in the soil remnants of the land. Are you considering aspects like that in your preservation that's non-design oriented? Because what we've discovered is that the field that we have on our campus is one of the last remnants of ancient indigenous technology.
Wow. What kind of technology? I'm just really curious.
It's remnants of fire.
Oh, okay.
Using fire for farming.
Yeah. So we have talked about, like, a lot of our landmark nominations that are coming in now do have sections on the indigenous history, and we return them if they don't. So we're asking for more complicated information that goes back farther. I actually worked on EB's, I worked for the National Park Service up on EB's historical reserve on Whidbey Island. And a key part of why that was one of the first areas settled was because it had been burned. They'd kept it as prairie land because it had been burned so often. So it is a key part of why these prairies are still here. That terraforming that was happening for generations before that, white settlers came up to find this open parkland, quote unquote. So we are trying to capture some of that story. I do think more needs to be done as just an ethnographic on its own. And for us, for the King County office, we have a specific tribal liaison who works government to government. And we work with him a lot on good approaches to tribes. On specific projects like the Muckleshoot, the Indian agency there, we're working directly with their cultural resource people to capture the story of that, but they are controlling that story. They're rewriting the National Register nomination. They're going to choose what they share with us. And so that's always kind of a tricky situation, because they are in control of their own story and they get to choose what story that is, but we all benefit from learning about the story. And so it's always kind of it's a negotiation to how much they want to share and how much we have access to and how much we can really broadcast is going to be a conversation. And there's some really, really valuable conversations happening in archaeology now, because archaeology is fundamentally built on studying another culture or other cultures. And so they're really talking about what their role should be and what how they need to go forward and how they can include, work with the tribes more, because fundamentally they're studying their culture. So these are, I don't have an easy answer for how we're doing this. I think we're handling this in multiple ways of trying to be respectful of all the people involved, and also just to have people raise awareness about the real depth of cultural landscapes that they're dealing with. So hopefully that sort of answers your question. But I'm interested, the more things you learn and that we can broadcast with each other, the more we can build on. So anything that you guys do, I'm more than interested in. I'm very interested in what you find down there, because it's going to be connected to things that we find here.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. And just to put a little marker there in the calendar for you, 2024 is going to be the 100th year of American Indian democracy in our country.
Oh.
So there's going to be a significant push to validate Indigenous science, Indigenous technology, affirming their sovereignty, their place, and so on. So just to put that out there as an opportunity to amplify.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Do we have any other questions? I have a couple. So, okay, while I wait for people to get to their hand raise function. And you can also drop questions in the Q&A below. And if you're on Facebook, Paige is monitoring Facebook for Facebook questions as well. Sarah, there's a type of nomination for the National Register called a traditional cultural property nomination. Has that been looked at as a template for more local level nominations?
Mm-hmm. It has. I would say the one issue, there are actually properties within the areas that we're considering in the White River Valley, especially that would qualify as TCPs. The one thing about TCPs that disqualify a lot of things is that they need to be in continual relationship with the tribes to qualify. So it's not just recognizing historic use, it has to be continual. And so that cuts down a lot of, like there's one, it's called Swing Rock. It was very important to a number of the tribes in the area, but it was also then used as a quarry for a long time. And so a lot of it's been destroyed. And so there are members of tribal communities that do still have a relationship with it. But we would really need to work to prove that link, like that it still has, it's in still continual relationship with tribes. And so that ends up disqualifying a lot of properties, many that we would look at.
Yeah.
But I think that there's a lot of it that can be translated. As we get farther in this process, I'm sure we're going to be using that as one of the models that we can build on.
Just in terms of, the significant statements, the criteria, I know that TCPs have more flexibility in some regards. So before we were officially recording this, we mentioned a little bit about how this has caught on in other cities, other county governments. Can you talk a little bit about where you've seen this gaining traction, and how big a movement is this now to look beyond architectural integrity to focus more on cultural significance and be a little bit more flexible in how we landmark things?
I was really surprised in Cincinnati. Like the first session I went to was the one about Cincinnati with the professor and the community leader who were partnering about this church, and then they were continuing on to other projects. I kept hearing it as presented almost as new information, and everyone was doing it separately, which is where we got the idea of the roundtable. I know Denver is really looking at cultural districts. Their modeling is much more on historic districts, but they're just starting to try to figure out how to adapt them to be better, more applicable to cultural landscapes, essentially urban cultural landscapes, which is what a cultural district would be. San Francisco is far ahead of the game because they have the 5. They are very regulated, and they have the money to do that, and they have the political will to change the market in San Francisco to accommodate community protection, which a lot of municipalities don't have. San Antonio is also always mentioned as one of the heavy hitters. They do a lot of the stuff before everybody else does. And Miami is another one. But one of the things that one of the reasons that I wanted to talk about this, we're all a lot of people, like San Antonio, I think have a decent sized staff. So does San Francisco. Miami doesn't have a huge staff, but they have some political will and things written to their criteria that makes some of this easier. What a lot of people are facing are small staffs, not a lot of funding, not a lot of support. They're trying to take on these giant projects without really the resources to do it. And so we're trying to find small ways to make the differences. So when we can attack the bigger projects, we're set up well to do it. So I will say that probably a lot of cities are talking about this. I'm getting a lot of good feedback from, and I didn't mention this, but during the forum, the three of us started just an Excel sheet list in categories of different resources you can use to find out information or access things, or studies other people have done and how successful they've been. Just a solid list, and we've been circulating it, and it's growing. And I'll send it to Susan to pass along to all of you. And if you see things that need to be on there, please put them on there. It's just getting circulated. But that's one of the ways that we're finding out what everyone else is doing, because a lot of us aren't talking to each other except at these national conferences. And so a lot of this is springing up almost organically as more and more people just become aware of the problems that are happening.
Okay, I'm not seeing anything in the chat. So there is quite a bit online, and thank you for offering to send more information. I'll be happy to distribute whatever you can send us. I did want to give a shout out to any websites, if we could post in the chat. I think I have one in my, double check I have it saved. This is the Beyond Integrity.
Yeah, that's probably the one I'd start with the Beyond Integrity, the core culture Beyond Integrity, because there's a lot of info there that can launch you into other spaces too.
Yes, so all the reports that you mentioned, those are all linked at this website, the www.forculture.org/beyond-integrity /. It is interesting that, and I have my own personal opinions on why it's been so architecturally focused in the past, when we do have other criteria, right? Architecture is not the only criteria that we should be judging things on. Do you have any sense of why this is sort of coming and like being addressed now and not before? Is this, well, I'll end there.
That's a large question.
Yeah, it is.
I mean, I think it's related to the overall, the reckoning, the cultural reckoning we've been going through with the George Floyd. I mean, everything is building into this reckoning that not only is going forward, political power, social power is translating into has been institutionalized in a very specific way with specific winners, but that happened historically too. Like if you're looking at that Mary Magdalene story, that happens all the time. People are erased to try to craft history to be framed in a particular way. And I think if you're having this reckoning that's happening as a cultural movement, it's going to extend backwards. But these Beyond Integrity has been around for a while. They've been around, I think, 6 years maybe. And there are other groups of people that have really been looking at this. And I think while we do have significant criteria, it's the integrity. If you're looking at integrity, all those 7 aspects of integrity are mostly physical. They're mostly about design. That's historic landscape have been about things reading as old or being high design. We've gone from the George Washington slept here through all down to the ages to we need to consider sites. Like I think it's just maybe we're maturing as a practice and we're recognizing our past failures. I think that just a lot of things are coming together to make people recognize that they live in a more dynamic world than we've been led to believe through our histories that we've recorded. And people are getting a little more sophisticated about recording these histories. We're not just going to the basic repositories where we consider oral history as important. We're taking into account a more dynamic understanding of what storytelling is in the history format, I think. And I think that's important. It's not just the dry history we learned in social studies in 7th grade anymore.
And as you said, recognition, even if it's not a regulatory nomination that's happening, recognition matters. That can have a cascading effect. I don't know if he's still in the attendees. We had somebody from the Community Archives Project. I wanted to give a quick mention to them. If anyone's interested in oral histories, check out the Community Archives Project. It's a partnership. The Tacoma Public Library is part of it, and I know they have information on their website. It's a way to sort of fill in some of the places in our public records where we've missed stories that are not represented, where there are gaps. And there's an intentional effort now to seek out these stories and document them. So separate from landmarking, but still it's another piece of that pie.
Mm-hmm.
So, all right. I don't see any questions. Have I missed anybody? Well, we are just 5 minutes early, so I will go ahead and say thank you. Oh, a message from Kevin Bartoy. Thank you, Sarah, for the presentation, and Susan for organizing. Well, you're welcome. Thank you, Sarah, for being here. This is a lot to digest, and I'm looking forward to going over this with more detail. So thank you so much. I appreciate this.
Thank you. You have a great night.
Have a great night, everyone.